My future son-in-law slid a prenuptial agreement across the restaurant table, one that valued my daughter's side of the family at almost nothing. And 3 weeks later, in my garage workshop, I slid a single sheet of paper back to him. A handwritten letter, 12 years old. He had read only 4 lines before his hands began to shake. Because he was the one who had written it when he was 18, sending it to a stranger who had completely changed his life. And before we begin, I just want to sincerely thank you for being here. I truly mean that. If you have a moment, leave me a comment and tell me where you're watching from, your city, your country, and what time it is there right now. Knowing who's sitting with me in this little room always makes telling these stories a little easier and a whole lot more meaningful. My name is Martin Doyle, Marty, to everyone who's ever mattered. I am 71 years old, and I live in the same modest brick house on the west side of Cleveland that my wife Helen and I bought in 1981, with the same workbench in the garage and the same Buick in the driveway that my daughter has been threatening to have towed as a public service since 2019. I taught machine shop at a public high school for 26 years. Before that, I was a machinist. My hands look like a map of everything they've ever done, and I have never once minded. Most people who meet me file me quickly. Retired teacher, fixed income, careful with a dollar, sweet old guy, probably one furnace repair away from trouble. I don't correct them. I never have. And I want to be honest with you right at the top about why, because this story doesn't work unless you understand it. It was never a game to me. It was never a trap I set for anybody. It was a promise. And to explain the promise, I have to tell you about a Tuesday in 1979, and about my brother Frank, and about the small brass fitting that quietly changed everything, and ruined nothing, because Helen and I refused to let it. In 1979, I was a 24-year-old machinist on second shift at a hydraulics plant off Brook Park Road, and there was a coupling we used on the lines that failed constantly. Leaked under vibration. Cost the company a fortune in downtime. I'd been turning the problem over in my head for a year, the way you work a knot in your pocket. And one night at my own bench at home, with Helen asleep and the radio low, I figured out the geometry. A self-seating collar. Simple, once you saw it. Everything good is. I machined a prototype on a borrowed lathe, and my foreman, a decent man named Stan Wozniak, God rest him, looked at it for a long minute and said, "Doyle, patent that before you show one more living soul." I spent $400 we did not have on a patent attorney. Helen didn't speak to me for a day and a half. Then the first licensing check came, and she sat down at the kitchen table with it in both hands, and she laughed, and then she cried, and then she said the sentence that became the constitution of our whole marriage. "Marty, we're going to act like this never happened." Because here's the thing you need to know. We had already watched money eat a family alive. Ours. My father died in 1974 and left a small windfall, an insurance policy, and a 2-family house. To my older brother Frank, with the understanding, spoken but never written, that Frank would look after our mother and split things fair. Frank was a good man. I want that said clearly, because what happened next was not villainy, it was gravity. The money changed how people talked to Frank, so it changed how Frank talked. He bought a boat before he fixed Mom's porch steps. He started measuring his brother's visits in what they might want from him. Within 6 years, my family, a family that had survived layoffs and a war, and my mother's temper, did not survive an inheritance. Frank died in 2003, and I learned about it from a cousin 4 days after the funeral. I have carried that 4 days for over 20 years. So when the coupling money came, and it kept coming, quarter after quarter, decade after decade, from license renewals I barely think about. Helen and I made our rule. The money would exist. We would not perform it. It would work in the dark like a furnace, heating the house without ever being looked at. The house stayed. The Buick's predecessors stayed. I stayed a shop teacher because I loved it, and because standing in front of 30 kids teaching them to respect a spinning lathe was the best job a man ever had. And in 1998, Helen found the money its real work. She came home from her sister's, where she'd heard about a neighbor kid, brilliant, first in his family to finish high school, who'd turned down college because the gap between his scholarship and the bill was $4,000. $4,000. She sat across from me at the same kitchen table and said, "Marty, we have a dam full of water, and there are fields dying of thirst within 10 miles of this house, so we built it. A scholarship fund for first-generation kids from Greater Cleveland. Kids whose parents worked shifts. Kids with jobs after school. Kids like the ones in my classroom. We ran it through a community foundation, fully anonymous, ironclad. We named it the Second Shift Scholarship, because that's when the real work of those families got done, after the first job ended. One condition, and it was Helen's, and it's the hinge of this entire story. Every recipient, at the end of their first year, writes one letter, not to us by name, to the founder, whoever that is. The foundation forwards them, stripped of anything that could identify us in return. Helen read every single one out loud at this table, some of them twice, and she kept them all. In her mother's old hat boxes, in the hall closet, sorted by year, 26 years of letters, hundreds of them. Helen died 5 years ago. Heart. Fast. Fast enough that my last words to her were about picking up milk, which is either a tragedy or exactly right, depending on the day you ask me. And the first spring without her, when the new letters came from the foundation, I sat down at this table alone and read them out loud anyway. To the chair. I still do. You can decide what that says about me. I decided a long time ago not to care. So, that's the man my daughter's fiancé looked at across 2 years of dinners, a widowed shop teacher in a cardigan with a Buick and a brick house. And I need you to hold all of it in your head, everything you now know, as I introduce you to Connor. My daughter Nora is 34, an ER nurse like her mother's sister, sharp and warm and constitutionally incapable of walking past someone struggling with a stroller. She met Connor Pierce 3 years ago. He's 38, a partner at a private investment firm downtown, and I'm going to tell you the truth about him in order, the way I learned it, because he's not a cartoon and I won't draw him as one. The first night Nora brought him to the house, he showed up with good coffee and better questions. He noticed the workbench through the garage door and asked about it, and not politely, actually asked, followed up, listened. He treated my daughter like weather he was grateful for. And when he told me his story, over pot roast at this table, I liked him more, not less. Father died when Connor was 9. Mother, Diane, a nurse. ICU, 30 years. Raised him alone on double shifts in a rented duplex in Old Brooklyn. He worked stockrooms through high school. And then, he said, he clawed his way to a full ride and never looked back. Nobody ever handed me anything, mister. Doyle, he said that first night, and he said it with his chin slightly up, like a man showing you a scar. Everything I have, I built. I remember thinking, good. A little proud, but proud of real things. Helen would have fed him twice. The change came the way it always comes. Not a heel turn, a drift. Watch for it in your own people, because it never announces itself. It accumulates. Year 2, the firm made him partner, and the drift picked up speed. He started narrating the prices of things, unprompted. The watch, the wine, the ski house they rented with his partners. He developed that habit, and you know the one I mean, of being warm to people above him and efficient to people below him. A valet, a waiter, the kid bagging groceries. Connor didn't insult them. He just processed them. There was one dinner I keep coming back to, maybe a year before the engagement, at a steakhouse he'd picked. Our server was a man about 60, working hard on a Friday night, and he brought Connor the wrong side dish. Asparagus instead of the Brussels sprouts. Small thing, nothing thing. The man apologized, and Connor said, "It's fine," in a voice that made it clear it was being recorded as not fine, and then, when the server had gone, he said to the table, lightly, like a joke, "You wonder how a guy gets to that age still writing down orders wrong?" Nora went still. I looked at that server across the room, 60-something, on his feet on a Friday night, doing honest work with a full section. And I thought about my father, who waited tables for 2 years after the plant cut back in '68, and never once called it a step down, because it wasn't. I didn't lecture Connor. Lectures bounce off armor. I just said, I had a year in my 50s where I got half my students' names wrong till November. Brains get full, son. They don't get worse. He laughed, missing it entirely. Nora didn't laugh. And when the server came back, she asked him how his night was going and used his name off the tag, Gerald, and tipped him herself, separately, in cash, on the way out, and I watched her do it and thought, Helen, look at her. We didn't lose a thing. There was also an afternoon he stood in my garage, looked at my 1975 South Bend lathe, a machine I have kept true for 50 years, a machine that made the first coupling, and said, not unkindly, "You know, they make computerized ones now. Nora and I could help with that." I said, "This one still holds 1/1000th of an inch." He smiled the way you smile, at an old man's superstitions. And then there were the retirement comments, arriving more often, softer than insults and heavier than they sounded. Fixed incomes are brutal right now, Marty. Have you two ever talked about what happens with the house, long term? There are some really dignified senior communities out east. Dignified. I sliced my pot roast and said the winters were fine and the furnace was new, and Nora changed the subject, and her eyes did a thing I recognized, because her mother's eyes used to do it too. The look of a woman filing something away and hoping she's wrong about it. If you have ever sat at a table while someone politely, generously planned a smaller life for you, If you've ever been managed by a person half your age who mistook your simplicity for your ceiling, then you know it doesn't make you angry. Exactly. It makes you quiet. And quiet, in an old machinist, is not surrender. Quiet is measurement. The engagement dinner was in early December, at a restaurant downtown with valets and a wine list bound in leather. Connor's treat, Connor's arrangement. 6 of us. Me, Nora, and Connor. Connor's mother, Diane, whom I'd met twice and liked enormously. A small, watchful woman with a nurse's forearms and a nurse's radar who said little and missed nothing. And 2 of Connor's partners with their wives, who spoke in property values the way other people speak in weather. I wore my good gray sweater and Helen's favorite tie, and I listened, because listening is free and it pays better than talking. Dessert arrived, and with it, the folder. Connor didn't slide it across dramatically. Give him that. He set it beside my coffee, leather-bound, tabbed, and said, with the ease of a man presenting a quarterly report he's proud of, Marty. Before the wedding planning gets crazy, I wanted us all aligned. Full transparency. It's how I do everything, inside. And I read every page while that table watched me and pretended not to. Was a prenuptial agreement, professionally drafted, thorough, and cold as a coroner's summary. His assets ran 9 pages. Nora's ran most of one. And then there was a page I was not expecting, and I want to read you its heading the way it read to me, because I've thought about it many nights since. Household contingencies. And under it, item 4, a projection of my likely future care costs, my house listed with an estimated value, and the word liquidation beside a date range, and a recommendation, in the attorney's bloodless font, that Mr. Loke, Doyle's residence be transitioned within 5 to 7 years to offset dependent care exposure. Dependent care exposure. I was a line item. My home was a hedge. My future was a liability my daughter's marriage needed to be inoculated against. Nora hadn't seen it. I knew that within 1 second, because I watched her read it upside down across the table, and watched the color leave her face floor by floor, and I watched her look at Connor with an expression I had not seen on her since she was 16, and caught a friend stealing from her locker. Diane, Connor's mother, set down her fork very carefully, the way ICU nurses set things down when they are choosing not to throw them. The partners studied the dessert menu with the intensity of scholars. And Connor, and this is the part that told me everything. Connor looked around the table, felt the temperature, and misread it completely. He thought the discomfort was for me. He softened his voice into that terrible register, the generous one. Marty, nobody's rushing anything. We just believe in planning. I've had to be realistic about money my whole life. Nobody ever handed me anything, so I protect what I build. You understand. Honestly, if that were you, holding that folder, being publicly pre-grieved by a man eating a $40 dessert, what would you have done? I'll tell you what I wanted to do. I wanted to stand up and empty the dam. Every account, every license, every zero, right there over the tablecloth, and watch the arithmetic hit him. It would have taken 30 seconds and felt magnificent for 10 of them. And then I heard Helen, clear as the espresso machine. Marty, we act like it never happened. We don't perform it. Not even now, especially not now. So I closed the folder, evened its edges with 2 fingers, and said, it's thorough. I'll read anything twice before I have opinions about it. And I asked the table who was having the cheesecake. But God was not finished with that dinner. Because 20 minutes later, Connor stood up to give a toast. He raised his glass to Nora first, and it was genuinely lovely. I'll give him that forever. And then he turned the toast, the way men like the man he was becoming always turned toasts, toward himself, toward the mythology, the duplex in old Brooklyn, the stockroom jobs, the night his mother cried over a tuition gap, and then he said it. He said, and then I won something called the Second Shift Scholarship, anonymous donor, full gap coverage, 4 years. And people always say, oh, someone helped you. No, I earned that. I outworked 400 applicants for it. Whoever funded it was just moving money. I'm the one who turned it into a life. His partners laughed and toasted, to turning it into a life. And I sat there, 71 years old, in Helen's favorite tie, with my heart going like a hammer mill, doing the math I did not need to do, because I already knew. Class of 2010. Old Brooklyn. Father deceased, mother an ICU nurse, essay about learning multiplication tables in a hospital cafeteria at 9 years old, while his mom finished a shift upstairs. I had read that essay at this kitchen table in the spring of 2010, out loud, to Helen, and Helen had stopped peeling potatoes, and put down the peeler, and said, that one, Marty. Whatever the committee says, that one. We had funded 11 kids that year. He was the 4th letter in the 2010 hat box. I didn't remember the name Pierce, because I never memorized names. Helen said the letters belonged to the kids, not to us. But I remembered the cafeteria. I remembered the peeler going down on the counter. The man who had just filed my house under liquidation was Helen's kid, and he had no idea. And I want to be very honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because it was not triumph. It was grief. A clean, specific grief. That somewhere between that hospital cafeteria and this wine list, a boy who wrote a thank you letter to a stranger had grown into a man who toasted himself for never being helped. I looked at Diane, his mother, across the table. She was watching her son with an expression I recognized from my own mirror in the years I worried about my brother Frank. Love, fully intact, and inventory, fully underway. I said nothing that night. I hugged my daughter, shook Connor's hand, complimented the restaurant, and drove the Buick home through the December dark with the radio off. And then I did the thing I have done for every large decision of my life. I went into the hall closet, and I brought Helen's hat boxes to the kitchen table, and I put on my reading glasses, and I found the spring of 2010. It was the fourth letter. One page, blue ink, the careful handwriting of a kid whose mother made him redo things. I'm going to tell you what it said soon. Not yet. There's an order to this, and the order matters, because I sat with that letter for 3 days deciding what a man is supposed to do when the past hands him a loaded truth. And I want you sitting with it too. Here's what I decided, and here's why. Nora came to me the day after the dinner, furious, ready to hand back the ring over household contingencies, and part of me, the father part, the animal part, wanted to let her. It would have been easy. It also would have been wrong, and I knew it was wrong because of a rule Helen and I learned from watching my brother. You don't judge people at their worst assumption. You judge them at their next choice. But only if somebody loves them enough to put the choice in front of them where they can't look away. Frank never got that. Nobody in our family loved him well enough to hand him the mirror early, when it could still matter. We just withdrew, and resented, and let the money finish its work. I was not going to run that play again on the man my daughter loved. So I told Nora, give me one conversation with him before you decide anything. Alone. At the house. She looked at me a long moment, her mother's filing look, and said, what are you going to do? And I said, return something that belongs to him. He came on a Saturday morning in January, and I'll slow all the way down now, because this is the scene, and I've replayed it enough times to give you every screw and shadow of it. He arrived in weekend clothes that cost more than my first car, carrying peace-offering coffee, wearing the strained, managed pleasantness of a man who has been told by his fiancée that this meeting will determine his future, and has prepared talking points. I didn't take him to the kitchen. I took him to the garage. My church, my office, 50 years of tools shadow-boarded on pegboard, the South Bend lathe under its canvas cover, the smell of cutting oil and cold concrete. He stood in it awkwardly, a man in a country whose language he'd stopped speaking. I pulled 2 stools to the workbench. On the bench, face down, under my hand, was one piece of paper. He started in on his talking points. Marty, about the dinner. The document was never meant to feel, and I held up my hand gently, the way I used to quiet a shop class before the safety lecture, and he stopped. Connor, I said, before you say anything you've rehearsed, I want you to read something, out loud, if you can manage it, and then we'll have the real conversation. I turned the paper over and slid it across the bench. I watched him take it in stages. First the paper itself, aged, soft at the folds, then the salutation, and a small polite frown, then the handwriting. And I watched the exact half-second the handwriting stopped being handwriting and became his handwriting, 18 years old, blue ink, the careful loops his mother made him practice. And I watched a grown man's face do something I have only otherwise seen on new fathers and on students the first time a machine nearly takes their fingers. Total, cellular attention. The garage went so quiet I could hear the space heater ticking. He looked at me. He looked back at the page. His hands, holding the paper, began, very slightly, to shake. Read it, I said, gently. You wrote it. You should get to hear it. And Connor Pierce, 38, partner, 9 pages of assets, read his own letter out loud in my garage, and his voice made it 4 lines before it stopped being a partner's voice at all. To the founder of the Second Shift Scholarship. I don't know your name, and they tell me I never will, so I'm writing this to a stranger. My mom is an ICU nurse. My dad died when I was 9. I used to do my homework in a hospital cafeteria, and I told myself that someday I'd be the kind of man who noticed kids sitting alone in cafeterias. You noticed me without ever seeing me. I don't know how to thank a person who won't let himself be thanked, so I'll do it this way. I promise I will never forget where I came from, and I promise that if I'm ever standing on the other side of a gap like the one you closed for me, I'll close it for someone else, quietly, the way you did, whoever you are. You bought a stranger's whole future for the price of staying invisible. I hope I meet you someday without knowing it, and I hope I'm someone you'd be proud of." He stopped. The heater ticked. Somewhere down the block, a snow shovel scraped a sidewalk twice and quit. "Who?" He started, and couldn't finish it, and started again. "Who gave you this?" "Nobody gave it to me," I said. "It was delivered to me, in the spring of 2010, by the Foundation, the way all of them are." And I stood up, and I opened the cabinet above the bench, where I'd moved them that morning from Helen's hat boxes, and I let him see. Hundreds of letters, banded by year, 26 years of blue and black ink. "Yours is the fourth one in from 2010, I said. My wife read it out loud at our kitchen table. She was peeling potatoes. She stopped. My own voice went rough there, and I let it, because a shop teacher knows the lesson lands better when the teacher isn't hiding either. She put down the peeler, Connor, and she said, "That one. Whatever the committee says. That one. I will not perform his falling apart for you like entertainment, because it wasn't entertainment. It was a man meeting himself, and that is a private weather system even when you're standing inside it. I'll tell you what matters." He didn't argue. He didn't ask about the money, the amounts, the accounts. Not that morning, not since, not once. And I want you to sit with that, because it's the detail that let me keep loving him. The first thing he said, when he could say things, was not a question about my wealth. It was, I toasted myself, at my own engagement, for never being helped. And the second thing he said was, "Does my mother know?" Because some deep instrument in him had already worked out that Diane, 30 years a nurse, watchful as a monitor, had been sitting at that dinner, listening to her son deny the existence of a hand she had prayed for nightly in 2010. And the third thing, after a long time, looking at the covered lathe, the coupling, the self-seating collar, on the hydraulic lines. We had a position in a components manufacturer for 6 years. I've read about that patent. He laughed. One broken syllable, the kind that's mostly something else. "I've made money off your invention without knowing your name. Twice." And here is where I have to be fair to him, fairer than that folder was to me, because I promised you he wasn't a cartoon. We talked for 4 hours in that garage, and the man who came out from under the partner was a 9-year-old in a hospital cafeteria who had converted terror into armor and armor into arithmetic. He told me about the night the power went out for non-payment when he was 11, and how his mother lit candles and called it an adventure, and how he lay in the dark doing math about how many shifts equaled how many bills, and swore an oath the way children do, total and secret and lifelong. That he would never be on the wrong side of that math again, and neither would anyone he loved. Every cold line in that prenup, every dignified community, every liquidation. It was that boy, still doing shift math in the dark, mistaking control for safety and safety for love. Nobody ever handed me anything, was never a boast, underneath. It was a spell, a thing he said so the dark couldn't come back, the tragedy. And the thing I made him look at kindly, with the letter between us, is that the spell required erasing the one proof he'd ever received, that the world contains quiet, unbilled kindness. To feel safe, he'd had to forget the very thing that saved him. The mistake most of us make with people like Connor, and with the Connors inside ourselves, is thinking the cure for their arrogance is humiliation. It isn't. I could have detonated him at that dinner in front of his partners, and I'd have won the evening and lost the man. The cure for a person who's forgotten being helped is not defeat, it's evidence. Handed over privately, with the door closed, by somebody willing to still be at the table afterward. What happened next took months, not minutes, and I'll give it to you honestly, because real repair is unphotogenic. The prenup died. He shredded it himself, at his own kitchen counter, Nora told me, and then did something better than shredding it. He and Nora built new documents together, both names, both futures, protections running both directions, and item 4, household contingencies, was replaced, at Connor's insistence, with a page his attorney reportedly found deeply irritating, formally titled Care of Martin Doyle, which states in plain language that I will live where I choose for as long as I choose, and that this family's job is to make my choices easier, not smaller. Nora framed a copy. It's in my hallway. I pass a legal document every morning that functions as an apology, and I nod to it, and I'm not ashamed to tell you so. He told his mother everything. Diane called me afterward, and we talked for an hour. Two people who'd spent decades watching over the same boy from opposite ends without knowing it, and at the end she said quietly, "I used to pray for whoever you were. By name, I didn't know. Every night, that whole first year," and I said, "Helen would have told you the prayers were received and neither of us managed much for a minute after that, and that's fine. Some phone calls are allowed to be mostly silence. And Connor asked me for something, not money. He has money. He asked to become a reader for the second shift scholarship. Application essays, spring cohort, a volunteer position that pays nothing and confers nothing. The foundation, not knowing his connection to anything, put him on the committee like anyone else. He read 40 essays his first spring. He called me one night in April, and his voice was strange, and he said, "There's a girl, cafeteria kid, does her homework at a laundromat while her mom works. Marty, I've read her essay 5 times." And I said, "What does the committee say?" And he said, "I don't care what the committee says," and then caught himself and laughed and said, "Oh no, I've become your wife." Helen would have considered that the finest compliment of her entire posthumous career, and I told him so. Something else started that spring, small and unannounced, the way the real things always start. He began coming by on Saturday mornings. The first time, he claimed it was to drop off coffee. The second time, he stood in the garage doorway for a while watching me true up a table leg for a neighbor, and finally said, "Would you show me?" So I did what I'd done for 26 years of teenagers. I put him on the broom first. Shop rules. Everybody starts on the broom. And he laughed. And then he swept, properly, corners and all. And I thought, there's hope for any man who sweeps the corners when no one's grading him. By June he could face off a piece of stock without me hovering. He's not good. I want that on the record, and he'd want it there too. The man has $40 dessert hands, and it shows. But one Saturday he spent 3 hours making a simple brass hook, plain as a sentence. And when it finally came off the lathe, he held it in his palm, the way he'd once held that letter, and he said quietly, "This is the first thing I've made in 15 years that isn't a number." I put it on the pegboard, in the middle, where the good work goes. It's still there. Helen's hand towels hang on it. And there was one more evening I have to give you, because it closed a circle I didn't know was open. In May, the foundation held its little annual dinner for the new scholarship class. A church basement, folding tables, sheet cake, the whole legacy of Helen's taste in celebrations. I go every year, anonymously, as a volunteer. This year, Connor and Diane came too, as committee people. And at some point in the evening I looked over and saw my daughter's husband sitting across a folding table from a 17-year-old laundromat girl and her exhausted, suspicious, magnificent mother. And he wasn't performing, and he wasn't processing. He was leaning in, forearms on the table, asking the girl what she wanted to build with her life, and listening to the answer the way you listen when you were once the kid at that table. Diane watched him too, from beside me, and after a while she said, "Not really to me. There he is. Just that. 2 words. 30 years in the making. I have received commendations in my life. None of them were that." The wedding was in June, at the parish hall on our side of town, folding chairs and peonies from 3 different neighbors' yards, Diane and me in the front row on the same side because, as Nora put it, "You're the same side." And at the reception, Connor stood up with his glass, and the room got quiet, and my daughter's husband gave the second toast of his engagement, the correction. He said, "A few months ago I stood up at a dinner and told a room that nobody ever handed me anything. I want to fix that on the record, in front of everyone I love. Somebody handed me everything, quietly, anonymously, starting when I was 18. And, I've since learned, in about 400 smaller ways I was too busy climbing to notice. I spent 20 years proud that I owed no one. I intend to spend the rest of my life proud of the opposite." He did not look at me when he said it. We'd agreed. The fun stays invisible. That was Helen's law, and it outlives us all. But when he sat down, he reached over, under the table, and gripped my forearm, one machinist squeeze, and that was the whole ceremony as far as I'm concerned. So what do I want to leave in your hands tonight, after all of this? 3 things, and then the porch light's yours. First, self-made is a story, and like most stories, it's built by leaving things out. Every self-made person you have ever met was carried at least once, by hands they've forgotten, misremembered, or never saw. That's not an insult to their work. It's the missing chapter of it. Second, when someone you love starts turning cold around money, do not assume greed first. Assume fear. Cold is what terror looks like once it learns to wear a suit. It doesn't excuse the folder they slide across your table, but it tells you where the screw is stripped, and you cannot fix what you refuse to locate. And third, the one I'd stamp on steel if I could. The deepest kindness has a strange cost, which is that its recipients may one day forget it happened. Do it anyway. Helen's rule. The furnace doesn't need to be looked at to heat the house. Here's the one thing I'm asking you to actually do today, not someday. Today, somewhere in your past is a hand you never properly thanked. A teacher, a boss who took the chance, a stranger, a scholarship, a neighbor, a parent. Write the letter. Tonight, on paper, even if the person is gone. even if you'll never send it, even if, like Connor's, it has to be addressed to a stranger. Because the letter isn't really for them. It's a repair you perform on your own story. You're writing the missing chapter back in before nobody ever handed me anything, has time to harden into a spell. And here is the question I want you to sit with, the one that letter forced into my garage like winter air. In the story you tell about your own life, whose hands have you erased to make yourself the hero of it? Now it's your turn, and I mean it when I say this is the part of the week I wait for. Put a number in the comments. Comment 1 if you think I did it right. Staying silent at that dinner, keeping Helen's rule, and handing him the letter in private, instead of the humiliation he'd arguably earned. Comment 2 if you think I went too easy. That a man who writes liquidation next to your house deserves the public version, and my daughter deserved to see the whole dam open that night. Comment 3 if you think the hardest truth here belongs to me. That a father who hides everything for decades, even from his own daughter, taught the people around him to underestimate him, and then graded them on it. I read every single comment with the morning coffee, and a while back one of you wrote about finding your late father's quiet donations in his checkbook after the funeral, and I sat with that one until the coffee went cold. Tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is there. It still amazes me that an old machinist's story reaches a security guard on nights in Lagos, and a schoolteacher at sunrise in Manila inside the same hour. And if you've ever been the one who was quietly helped, or the one who quietly helped and was forgotten, tell us below. Somebody scrolling right now is halfway to hardening their own spell, and your comment might be the letter that reaches them in time. If this story handed you something tonight, subscribe and tap the bell, because I'm here every week with another one. Family, money, pride, and the long patient machining of people back toward each other. And I'd be honored to have you at this workbench for the next one. From a garage on the west side of Cleveland, where the lathe still holds 1/1000th of an inch and the hat boxes are full. Thank you for staying to the very last word. Thank your hands. All of them, even the ones you never saw. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Cleveland to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.